Hi, this is Richard Claus from Student Engagement Staff at Winnetka Community College. Our Philosophy 101 readings continue. We are making a move a little bit. We're still in ethical theory, but we're actually now looking at that branch of it that has to do with social justice. We might even think of this as political philosophy. And so these probably have much more contemporary application to it. So there's a contemporary feel to it as we start talking about these issues of social justice, how we might structure the political realm. And in particular, we're looking at this issue of the social contract. So again, hopefully you've done your readings. What I want to attempt to do in this time is to sort of be a guide through the readings. We're going to read pieces of it together. If you've read it, great. If you've not, maybe watch these sections, take notes, highlight some things in your textbook. That'd be great. It'll just help you understand the material that much better. But we're on page 569 of the 4th edition. If you're using the 5th edition, it's page 543. And we're looking at the issue of the social contract, particularly as it is by Thomas Hobbes. You can see the dates listed there for Thomas Hobbes. This is intriguing. Our author says this. He says, unlike Aristotle's belief in the original primacy of the social community, Hobbes contends that human beings begin in the state of nature, unconstrained by laws or social agreements. That's going to be crucial. This state of nature is going to pop up in Hobbes. It's going to be continued on in John Locke. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is going to use this idea of the state of nature as sort of this hypothetical device. And I think that's important to grasp. It's imagining going back before there was any politics, any sort of government systems, any sort of communities together. And Hobbes recognized that we live in what he calls the state of nature. And he says that this is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You can see our author lists the nasty, brutish, and short listed there. The solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This is not a good way to exist. Everybody is simply a law unto themselves, seeking to eke out whatever kind of existence they can. And the thing that motivates them, as we'll see in the reading, is this fear of death. And so death is really what motivates ultimately politics or the social construct or the social contract in Thomas Hobbes. And so his major work, you can see at the bottom of 569 there, is Leviathan. And if you read a little bit about Leviathan, it was an ancient mythological sea creature. It was sort of a force of chaos, a force of rule you didn't want to mess with because it would hurt you. And so he calls his work Leviathan, which is intriguing because that's what he's going to think of the state as. We need a Leviathan. We need something that can control, that we actually all fear together to control us. And so that work was done in 1641. On page 570 in the green box, there's a few pieces that are interesting here that our author draws attention to, but in the actual words of Hobbes, he writes, nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind. And as Chaffee points out, our author, that this is sort of unique in the history of philosophy up to this point, that he recognizes a certain kind of equality to what it is to be human. All of us have similarly notions of our bodies, similar needs, similar basically notions of our faculties. We have the same faculties. Yes, there are people that are more intelligent, maybe develop those faculties more, but the similar faculties. And so because of this, these similarities can allow us then to think of others and to sort of think of what might be the common good as we come together. Since we all have the same faculties of body and mind, we all have the same fears, this would move us to want the same goals that we might then engage with a sort of a supreme state or a sovereign, as Thomas Hobbes calls it. Intriguing. He lists over on 571 some of what he says about what moves people. In the green box here at 571, again, men have no pleasure, but on the contrary, a great deal of grief in keeping company, where there is no power able to overawe them all. Basically, we don't have pleasure being around people if there's not some sort of governmental structure, what he calls this structure that can overawe them all, sort of controls them. If you have a controlled environment, I don't mind saddling up next to somebody because I'm not worried you're going to kill me or steal from me or take from me what I have. But without that governmental constraint, without this one to overawe them all, then I don't want to be around people because they might want to take things from me. He mentions later on in that paragraph, he says, hereby it is manifest that during the time when men live without a common power to keep them all in all, that government system, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. Key phrase, key understanding of Hobbes' notion of the state of nature. It's a time of war of all against all. That's what he sees it. This is not a positive view of human nature. He's not looking upon people as naturally good, but rather naturally bad, that they're going to hurt you. Matter of fact, without this governmental system to overawe everybody, then all we do is war and fight each other. He goes on, he mentions on the bottom of that page 571 in the green box, you see listed there that he mentions the famous phrase at the end of the first paragraph, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death in the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I did look up that phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. I always like to find this out. Has any musical groups ever used these phrases? And there's actually, I think an Australian indie punk band that had, the name of their album was called Nasty, Brutish, and Short. And so if you learn nothing else, you can at least be aware of that phrase, because at times it pops up in our culture in all sorts of different ways, including indie punk bands. On the next page, on 572, continuing in Hobbes' section there, at the very beginning, right across from the picture, the desires and other passions of man are in themselves no sin. That's intriguing. It doesn't, whatever you feel, whatever you want to do isn't itself wrong. No more are the actions that proceed from those passions till they know a law that forbids them. It's only once we create a government that puts a law in place, then we have wrongdoing. Which till laws be made they cannot know, nor can any laws be made till they have agreed upon the person that shall make it. He's going to go on. We're going to see this more at the bottom of the page as well. He mentions, as our author brings out, that there are two forces, or two cardinal virtues. I think he's being tongue-in-cheek here, because they're not really virtues. What he calls force and fraud in the state of nature. So they're not virtues. All we have is force. If I want you to do something, I make you do it. I hit you with something, or I beat you up, and I make you do what I want you to do. Or fraud. I lie to you. I engage in some sort of deception, and so that I get what I want from you. So those are the two cardinal virtues in the state of nature, and we all recognize those aren't really virtues, but that's all we have, according to Hobbes, in the state of nature. The very bottom of this page is an intriguing passage on 572. At the green section there at the very bottom. To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent, or this follows, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, have there no place in the state of nature. Where there is no common power, no government system, there is no law. Where there is no law, no justice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. Justice and injustice are none of the faculties, neither of the body nor mind. Fascinating, because he's going to say that there is no justice. There's no conception of justice in the state of nature. So there's no transcendent notion of justice you might find in other philosophers, like Plato, for example. There's this form of the just or the good. Hobbes, there's none of that. If you're in a state of nature, there's no such thing as justice or injustice. That only becomes something that is created. And so that morality is created by a governmental system. And I think that's important to recognize. Going on to 573, that same green box area, the last paragraph. The passions that incline men to peace are fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, sort of a common kind of living, and a hope by their industry to obtain them. So it moves us ultimately to say, hey, this is not the best state, the state of nature, but we maybe need to somehow come together, create some sort of governmental system, is itself the fear of death. If I'm living in a state where the only two virtues are fraud and force, somebody's going to eventually be bigger than I am and is going to kill me. And I'm afraid of dying, but I'm also guessing you're afraid of dying too, so why don't we sort of make a mutual compact? And so that's the idea that the social contract is getting at in Hobbes. Out of the state of nature, this fear of death creates this desire amongst common people, with common faculties, common bodies, to create a system that will help alleviate that fear of death. That if we both relinquish some of our rights, actually for Hobbes, almost all of your rights, to the sovereign, he'll then provide the framework in which we can now live and not have to be afraid of dying because of force and fraud. On 573, there's a lengthy quotation by Hobbes. I want to look if you go down to the second, third, fourth paragraph, about middle of the way. And because the condition of men, as hath been declared in the precedent chapter, is a condition of war of everyone against everyone, we've already seen that, in which case everyone is governed by his own reason, and there is nothing he can make use of that may not be a help unto him in preserving his life against his enemies, it follows, if you accept that, it follows that in such a condition every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. Again, there's no sense of justice, there's no sense of even, personal rights. Those come later. There's nothing like that. He says, if I have this right to just pursue whatever I want, I even have the right to the use of your body. I want you to think about that, what that might mean for sexual ethics in terms of rape. And therefore, he goes on, therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endures, there can be no security to any man, how strong or wise soever he be, of living out that time which nature ordinarily allows men to live. And consequently, it is a precept or a general rule of reason that every man ought to endeavor peace, as far as he has hope of attaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. I'm seeking peace ultimately because I want security. And if I can't get it that way, then all I'm left with is war. He goes on, the first branch of which rule contains the first and fundamental law of nature, which is seek peace and follow it, and second, the sum of the right of nature, which is by all means we can to defend ourselves. He goes on, from this fundamental law of nature by which men are commanded to endeavor peace is derived the second law, that a man be willing, this is crucial, when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down this right of all things that he used to have, and be contented with so much liberty, which is going to be a reduced liberty, against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So I'm going to allow, since I'm not going to now continue to be in this state of nature where I have everything's available to me, including someone else's body, I don't want my body being used that way, so I will lay down enough of my rights, and if they lay down enough of their rights, and they're seeking peace in this regard, that maybe then together we'll have this sense of peace because we have created this governmental system. He goes on, for as long as every man holds this right of doing anything he likes, so long as all men are in the condition of war, but if other men will not lay down their right as well as he, then there is no reason for anyone to divest himself of his, for that were to expose himself to prey, or to becoming, it's like an animal which is killed, which no man is bound to, rather than to dispose himself to peace. This is that law of the gospel, whatsoever you can require that others should do to you, that you do unto them. Again, we see this golden rule come up. And again, recognize the context out of which Hobbes is writing, heavily influenced of Western civilization by Christendom, so he mentions the gospel. Everybody likes to have Jesus in their philosophy someplace, and so he tries to co-opt Jesus' use of the golden rule for this state of nature. Whether that is a good use of the New Testament or not is probably something to think about. And so those are the key pieces. Again, we're seeing that in Hobbes there's a state of nature, war of all, against all. And again, recognize for Hobbes, there's a few things now I want to go over that are not in the textbook that maybe sort of flesh out some of his philosophy. What Hobbes then did with this, because our reading doesn't go over this. But I think it's helpful to understand what Hobbes was actually looking for. He himself, when he talks about a sovereign or this Leviathan, he prefers a monarchy. He likes the fact of a single king. And the power for Hobbes of the sovereign or the monarch is unlimited. That's key. This sovereign, this is not about we've made rights with each other, like people to people. This is rather, we have made sort of a covenant or a pact or a promise with the sovereign. We relinquish these rights unto him, and it would have been a male in this culture, right? And that person now has sovereign authority. Matter of fact, the people only basically vote once in this hypothetical view of the state of nature. They create this, and now then the sovereign has the right to figure out who is going to succeed him. And he recognizes that most kings are going to follow naturally in terms of their family. The king's son, either firstborn or one of his sons, will sit on the throne. And he's fine with that. We need to have this sovereign that has almost unlimited power. He has the right to censorship. He has the right to the laws of property. Since property is created by the government and there's no property in the state of nature, then the sovereign gets to dictate how property is used. And for Hobbes, he recognizes, we start thinking of this and think, this sounds like despotism or totalitarianism. This sounds like extreme radical rule. And Hobbes is going to grant that. He says, yes, but that is better than the state of nature. Despotism or totalitarianism is better than anarchy. Anarchy is what he feared. So again, there is full submission to the sovereign. Teachers, for example, in the educational system are ministers of the sovereign. They teach what he wants them to teach. There are no property rights. The sovereign is not subject to civil law. He can't be sued. The right to punish comes from the sovereign. The sovereign is also the head of the church, the religious institutions. That's key because, again, in this time you would have had a little bit of separation of powers at times, and there's always a struggle between the church, usually sometimes the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy or the Pope, and, the civil government. And for Hobbes, he said, well, here's how I do it. The civil government, the sovereign, just rules over the church as well. Two issues to notice in Hobbes, the key questions. Think about, what does he think is the best form of government? And the answer is a monarchy. And what are the powers of the sovereign or the monarch? And they're basically absolute. And again, if you think about this is helpful as we start moving now into John Locke next time. There are two dangers in the social realm. Thinkers have pointed this out. There is the danger of anarchy, where everybody does their own thing with no standard whatsoever, anarchy. But the other danger is despotism, or totalitarianism, this radical rule of an individual, or even maybe a group of individuals over the populace that controls even their every thought, every action. Hobbes was obsessed with only one side of it. He was obsessed with anarchy. We need to avoid anarchy at all costs. And so if it gives us even a despot, it gives us a tyrant, that's fine. As long as the sovereign has the power to keep peace, he can do whatever he wants. The problem is, though, a sovereign or a tyrant can keep peace by putting everybody in jail, or the most people in jail, either literally or figuratively, as we know in different states today. They can create an atmosphere in which people are afraid to do anything or almost everything except at the dictates of the sovereign. Hobbes said, I'm fine with that. Locke, as we're going to see, was concerned with both anarchy and despotism. He wanted to avoid anarchy just as much as Hobbes did, but he also said this despotism, this totalitarianism, this tyranny is something we need to avoid as well. And so he's going to attempt to chart a different path, utilizing some of the same constructs, the state of nature, the social contract, but to avoid both anarchy and despotism. It's intriguing to watch. Here's the practical application for today. Watch for those two poles. A lot of times we don't see them in their full-blown manifestations in our culture. We don't see radical anarchy, nor do we see radical despotism. But we do see people pushing toward one or the other. And so I think it's helpful to understand these concepts, to understand what kind of social philosophy are we developing where we might avoid both of those, avoid both anarchy and despotism. All right, until next time we look at John Locke, I'm Richard Claus. Hopefully you had a great time, and hopefully you are staying safe. All right, thanks.